So my understanding is that we are far enough back, so we're going to take our masks off so you can hear us. It is such a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for making this journey out on a Friday evening in February, which I guess isn't so bad here in Seattle. I'm from Michigan, and so they're getting flurries, and yeah, it's just a horror show, but it's cold there. So I want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank Seattle Opera, Alex Mianmi, who is one of the best people to work with. Christina Scheppelman, Ayana. There's just a whole group here. So thank you, thank you. And I have the real joy of introducing our guest person, who's actually been here in Seattle now for probably a few weeks. Terrific. So this is Tazewell Thompson. He is yes, absolutely. It is such a joy to have you here, and I think I'm going to sit down. My name is Naomi André. I am the Seattle Opera Scholar in Residence, which is something I absolutely love. Oh, thank you. And so I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and of course I have my little security blanket, a pad with some notes on it, so please forgive me for bringing the nerdy professor in, but we're going to have a wonderful conversation. Tazewell and I will have, I'll ask some questions, but I have a feeling it's going to evolve into a conversation because I've been looking forward to this. And you are very welcome to the people who are physically here to ask questions, as well as the live stream people. Thank you so much for tuning in. And so we are going to have a combination of questions up here, questions here, physically in the same space, and then in our virtual space. So welcome to everyone here. All right. I think I've done just an opening of introductions, but I have to say I'm so happy to see you. It is just a thrill, and even though I know you're so busy, and I'm a little busy, and so this is sort of a time for us to actually speak in public, but which is, I'm sort of opening it up to let you all know that we actually have met each other, oh gosh, we've known each other for a few years now. And it started here in Seattle. Feel free to use your microphone because everybody wants to know. Yeah, let's.
Hello?
Yes, you're on. So I think, and I should have looked this up. Was it the summer of August 2017 before a Porgy and Bess?
I believe it was, yes. We were here, I wouldn't say to promote Blue, but we did a workshop here of Blue.
Yes.
And it was under the umbrella called Breaking Glass.
Right, that was sponsored through Glimmer Glass
That's
Opera,
right.
Francesca Zambello,
Yes.
and we went around, and we were also talking about Porgy and Bess since that was going to be performed here. But we also got to hear a couple of numbers. I think it was The Mothers, Go Figure,
Yes.
which has become one of my favorite numbers. Right. And then I think Kenneth Kellogg was here, or
I believe he was, but Kenneth Kellogg was, he was cast very early. Kenneth Kellogg plays the father in the opera Blue, and Brianna Hunter, who plays the mother.
Right.
I had never met her before, but she was part of this particular event, and she sang the aria from Blue, Go Figure. And I was naturally, drawn into her talent and her compassion. And then she was also part of the panel.
Yeah.
And she spoke brilliantly about, her life in opera, beginning her life in opera. We had a connection. We knew a couple of people that we discovered that as what happens when you're in the world of opera theater, it's a very small world. And then taking the plane back to New York City, our plane was delayed, so we went to the food court and we had a wonderful, long conversation about myriad subjects. And I soon as the plane landed and I went to my home in Harlem, I called the composer, Janine Tesori, and I said, "We have our mother. I just met her." And that's how things happen. And you'll see, if you haven't seen the opera, there was a final orchestra dress last night, and tomorrow is the opening. You will see that I can't imagine anyone else in the role. She is breathtakingly wonderful. And there's a scene she has in Act 2 that's just going to knock you out. She's extraordinary. And I have to say, Seattle Opera has done a magnificent job in casting the opera. Kenneth Kellogg, again, repeats his role as the father. Gordon Hawkins, who some of you may know, he's performed here. He plays the Reverend. And the son is played by a singer who played Charlie Parker. And I'll just briefly tell you how I feel about that, and then we'll go on because she's supposed to be in charge.
Oh, no.
But, but here is a very fascinating tale of opera and casting. And when I wrote the role for the son, not only did I imagine he would be a certain age, it's in the opera that he should be a high school student. And Joshua Stewart is a lot of things, but he's not a high school student. And he's, in fact, in his early 30s. He's 6'5", which is fine. You know, there's teenagers can be that tall. That's in high school basketball. And he's bald.
Oh, but you know, I would have never known that.
So when I realized who that was, I furiously wrote to Seattle Opera, "How could you do this? Who is this person? What are you doing to me? You're sabotaging this opera."
Gosh.
And, you know, Christina Scheppelman, and she says, "No, yes, I understand, but, you know, meet him and work with him." So I arrived for rehearsals. He's a very engaging man, very talented, an extraordinary singing voice. But he was not a high school student. So we continued to work, and we worked on costumes for him. And then the wig department here came up with the most extraordinary wig for him. So then in the piano dress, it started to, you know, my feelings about this just went away. And especially last night at the final orchestra dress, I was so moved by that scene, and we'll talk about that scene later on. He is magnificent in the role. Yeah. And so what this taught me, and I'm also a teacher, and every time I teach my students, I learn something. And every time I direct, I discover something. And I discovered, you know, because this is personal to me, I wrote the opera, that I needed to open up my parameters, and I needed to allow that in the world of opera, the voice is extraordinarily important.
Yeah.
And certainly, you know, we don't have to anymore, as in the turn of the last century, Juliet does not have to be 700 pounds. She could be someone who looked like a young girl who sings Juliet. And here, too, this man in his early 30s completely convinced me that he was the son that I wrote when I wrote Blue. And that was a good lesson learned and a great discovery. And I credit Christina Scheppelman for thinking of him, because she told me how extraordinary he was at Charlie Parker. And I said, "Charlie Parker? Yes, great, but he's not a teenager." Anyway, he is a teenager in this role, and you'll see that.
I love the way you talk about how you got to see something. I mean, you are a playwright, you're a librettist, you're a director of plays, you're a director of operas. So, you know, you've been doing this for a while, and yet to take the sort of the leap, the trust that, okay, this is who they've given me. And a wonderful thing, and I have had wonderful conversations with Christina Scheppelman. She really seems to take her role as nurturing different singers. And it's particularly nice with singers of color, how they don't just sort of pop in and then roll out, but to actually work with them more and more. So I'm so glad she was able, and just from knowing her, she's a woman who knows she has a vision, and she listens, and so.
It's true, and of course, with any other
that.
opera, I would certainly just leave it up to the opera house to make decisions and work with it and trust. Here, it was, I was very close to the opera, and I needed to just open up my my feelings, my parameters, and allow that this was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing.
Well, let's talk about those different roles, those different hats you wear, because though you have a lot of experience directing and writing plays and directing operas, what was it like to write this libretto? Was it something that you had been thinking about in the past? Oh, wait a minute, I could do this. Or was it something where an opportunity came up and you said, wait, this sounds like the right project? How do you bring your other hats of director and playwright to Blue?
I had never, ever thought that I would be writing a libretto.
Okay.
And yes, I've written plays and poetry. I was commissioned about a year ago to write something. The New York Times called me and asked me to write an opinion about the closing of Broadway theaters. And they were so taken with it, they used the entire opinion page in the New York Times to show it with some photographs. And I had already written the libretto, of course, by then, but it had never, ever occurred to me. Now, I also need to say that, and I'm going to drop a name, Aaron Copland contacted me, and he had written an opera called The Second Hurricane. And through his friends, he had heard about my work, and that I'd written plays and written poetry, and he asked me to come to his home in Peekskill. And I did. It was a wonderful studio and wonderful home. And he said, I want you to look at this Second Hurricane. He said, I've always wanted to have this performed. He said, we were in rehearsals and it was canceled because the director decided to go off to Hollywood and direct a movie called Citizen Kane.
Oh, my goodness.
And he said, he said, and it was originally, so then I tried to get it on television. And it's a work for young people to sing, and it's all about children who are lost during a hurricane and how they survive. And he said, and I know you work closely with children, I know you teach, and my friends said that I should meet you, he said, so read. So I read, I said, now? And he said, yes. Oh my goodness. He went off to another room, and I went through libretto, and I said, yes, I'd be interested. He said, no, what I want you to do is to rewrite the libretto. So that was my first, wasn't original, but that was my first opportunity to work on a libretto. And then I thought, and we performed it and received wonderful reviews. And,
wow.
And it was to celebrate his birthday. It was a citywide celebration of his birthday.
Was this in the late 80s?
Yeah, 85.
Okay, because I think he passed in 90 or 91, yeah.
That's correct. And he was born in 1900 in Brooklyn, and so it was his 85th. So anyway,
wow.
Years later, I had a wonderful relationship with Francesca Zambello, who runs the Glimmerglass Festival in Cooperstown, New York. And she wrote, and I'd done several productions up there. I love working at Glimmerglass. And she wrote to me an email and said, I have a composer already chosen, Janine Tesori. Do you know her? And I wrote back, no, don't know her. I know of her. Said, well, I've asked her to do an opera, and I want to have an opera that deals with what's going on in the world right now, either politically or socially, but I just feel that I need to respond. And so she listed 5 names. She says, what do you think of these writers? And then I wrote back and I said, what about me? I don't see my name. I don't see my name. So she said, well, you know, you're always busy, and you know, and I thought of you, but then, you know, you hadn't, you know, you've not written a libretto, and I just thought, you know, but I would like your input. So I then wrote back, again, what about me?
And so was there something, the project was still so broad, right?
It was, yes.
And you didn't even know her that well.
It was just that she wanted Janine to be the composer of whatever it was going to be.
But what drew you to it? You
well,
said,
so
it's time
I
for
said,
me to do a libretto.
I said to myself, I said, now how do I break through this? and just get her to. So then I just called her. I said, you know, Cheska, I really would like to be considered. She says, well, but, all right, send me a couple of your plays that you think might appeal to me that it could be a libretto. So I said, well, give me a couple of weeks. I think I'll do something better than that. So I didn't know what the opera was going to be, but what was bothering me, what was haunting me, what was disturbing me, was incident after incident of unarmed black boys and men who were being killed by police officers. I wrote a 7-page treatment of my feelings about that, and I wrote it in what I thought would be a libretto form.
How so?
Sorry?
How so? What made it? Was it a scenario where you had
question.
Act 1, Act 2?
I wrote 2 short scenes, and I realized in the librettos that I had been involved with directing, that, and I went back and I looked at, you know, and I looked at American operas or operas that were written in English, Kurt Weill in particular I looked at. And I looked at the English version of Dialogues of the Carmelites, my favorite opera. And I saw that it was very spare what was on the page, because that would allow the music to enter in. Something that I learned later on through Janine Tesori. So I wrote the scene with the mother and father, which is very different from what is on the stage now. And I wrote a scene about the girlfriends of this mother. And so I sent it to Cheska. She says, well, I don't know. She said, send it to Janine and see what she thinks. So Janine wanted to meet with me.
Oh,
she
so
was
she
intrigued.
liked it.
And she says, you know, she says, I had no idea what we were going to write or what I was going to compose. She said, and so we met at a restaurant on the Upper West Side. I was introduced to avocado toast through her. And we had a wonderful
huge sensation.
time. Right, and it was a sensation. And we had a wonderful time, and I got to really, you know, I got to know her, and she, you know, however one could get to know another person over avocado toast. And she said, you know, I think we should write something, you're right, about the constant injustices and the unrelenting awfulness that's going on in the world when it comes to black men and boys who are profiled and sometimes killed. So that's really how it started, that, you know, that
so
I would be involved with this libretto. She chose me.
And these conversations you were having over avocado toast were in 2015, 16?
No, yes, you're right. Actually, it was about 2015 or so.
Because I'm thinking of how sadly violence against young black men is not new. However, for me, it feels like 2012 with the Trayvon Martin murder, and what with social media and then with cell phones, it sort of came to this new level.
Yes, and you know, the very prescient and sad week that this is while we were in rehearsals, and a couple of us in the rehearsals, we had to stop and talk about it, is that on Wednesday was the 2nd year anniversary of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery.
Jeez.
But tomorrow night, on opening night, will be the 10th anniversary of the killing of Trayvon Martin.
Oh my gosh.
February 26th.
Oh my gosh.
10 years ago, this young boy was walking in the rain wearing a hoodie
Right.
and eating Skittles, and George Zimmerman, he said so in court. He said he was black and he looked suspicious.
Right.
That's why I shot him.
Wow, this 10th anniversary,
Is
how
on our opening
horrifying.
night. Yeah.
And we're seeing, you wrote this and it premiered in 2019, which is before George Floyd, before Ahmaud Arbery, before some of these really high-profile cases, and just
Breonna Taylor, yes, yeah.
how horrible it is that your play, your opera, was so sort of prescient. It sort of brought the past, the deep past, the recent past, and then sort of what's happening. Yeah, there's just.
I also need to say
momentous.
is that I congratulate the community of Seattle. As I watched in the news that went everywhere after the George Floyd killing, how everyone in this town seemed to come together and marched and protest and stood their ground and you know, went face to face with the authorities. And in Seattle, the profile that came out of Seattle, where everyone, young and old, black and white, it was extraordinary. And so coming here with Blue had really deep meanings for me, and I feel very honored and privileged to present this opera here in Seattle. And I also, the other day, there was, well, I think it was last night, I heard there was a protest against what's going on in Russia and with Ukraine. And so, Seattle, bravo to you, bravi to you.
As somebody who's getting to know Seattle more over these past few years since I've been connected as the scholar in residence here, I am really, I've always heard good things about Seattle, but I'm really seeing them and experiencing this sort of openness and sort of this, I'm trying not to use the word liberal because that carries so much baggage, but just a thought process and being open. I remember talking to people during moving into the presidential race and how all these different candidates that weren't getting so much attention, there were people in the audience talking about them. I mean, it was just pretty amazing. Also, last summer, or last October when I was here for Bohème, I went to the Capitol Hill area and saw with the autonomous zone. And so this was Seattle's particular special way of honoring sort of what was coming out of the summer of 2020. And it's still there, my understanding is that it's still there, or at least it was in October. And there's a real sense of, like, Seattle is a special place for thinking about
It's a city
these
that
issues.
doesn't forget and
Yeah.
feels responsible, and they take action, and they're compassionate.
Yeah.
That's the word. And they understand the shared humanity of the world. And it saddens me, and it scares me, quite frankly, where we are now as a country, the divisions and the unkindness and the behavior of the slightest thing. It's just, and that there seems to be an empowerment for people to say anything and not understand the consequences of what it means to children who hears these things, or to somebody else, to the rise in anti-Semitism, the rise in anti-Asian. And and the thing that really, and here in Seattle, I remember when I was here several years ago at the Rep, and I discovered the wonderful bookstores in town. The banning of books The banning of books.
There's some really frightening things happening with curriculum.
Terrifying.
Yeah. One of the ways that we can handle, or maybe a part of a resistance movement, is to be able to talk about these things through feelings. And I loved what you were saying about Seattle being a place where humanity seems to come to the forefront more than in some other places. And the arts really show that there's a humanity. Having an opera like Blue, which is about an all-Black cast, about a story that has a particular relevance in the Black community, but is not limited to the Black community. And seeing this family and seeing them develop in the first act. I know that there's some people, or I'm actually thinking probably nobody in the audience has seen this opera yet here because of the pandemic. It was supposed to travel after the Glimmerglass premiere in 2019, in the summer of 2019. And then because of the pandemic, everything shut down. This performance is really special. There was one other performance of Blue in Detroit this past September, and it was an outdoor performance at the Aretha Franklin Amphitheater. I got to see it there, and it was pretty amazing, but it was huge. And it's not that McCall Hall is small, but it wasn't sort of the big outdoors with the water behind and the boats. This performance is in a house, and it's the first time it's been in a house since its premiere. So yay, Seattle, you've got it. And from the dress rehearsal I saw last night, it's really powerful. It does a couple of things simultaneously. It's big with big themes, but it's intimate because you get to know, it's not a cast of thousands. It's a cast of a mother, a father, the reverend, the baby who turns into a boy, and then some police buddies and some girlfriends. And so you've got this intimate community, but everyone plays another role, or the three police buddies and the three girlfriends. So they're a chorus, but they're also individuals. So we get to see this sort of the reality of this family, the intimacy with these big themes. And I just wanted to give people sort of a little energy for what's coming. Getting back to behind the scenes, were there certain parts? And thank you for telling us sort of how it began to come together and how it sounds like you really weren't looking for libretto, but this story sort of drew you in. You're like, what about me? What about me? Were there certain parts? Can you tell us? And I'm so interested, and I think people who don't write operas but who love them, are interested to know what goes on behind it. When you did that first scene of the girlfriends, how did it come together? Was it a story that you and Janine talked about? Was Francesca Zambello involved? Did you do sort of the big mapping of, I'm going to have a 2-act opera with these scenes, and how does it happen?
That's a wonderful question, and I have kept a diary. It's something actually that I've done since I was a child. I loved to write when I was a child. I was attracted to letters, to words, always. And, other kids were given crayons and they made pictures. I would write words. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a convent. I was separated from my parents when I was very young. My parents had a lot of problems, and I was sometimes left with their friends. I was sometimes placed in just strange places. And eventually, my grandmother on my father's side realized that I was being neglected. And I was sometimes, I'm not too much into my story, but it gives you some kind of context. And I would, left in these various mysterious places, I would gravitate to see what was in these places that I could read. And so it began there, really, is that the process of what a word looks like on a page. I've always been fascinated by a word next to another word. and what the word means and the different meanings of the words. I was extraordinarily nerdy, even at a very early age, not even knowing what nerdy meant at that time. But while I was in this convent, and I was there for several years, almost 8 years of my life, I learned how to read music. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Sister Benvenuta would come in with her metal trolley that was filled with recordings from opera, not even liturgical music or Gregorian chants, opera. And so years later, I found out that she wanted so much to be in the world of opera. Oh. She didn't have the voice of it, but she loved opera because her father around the house would just start singing opera, so she was connected. So I learned how to read music, and I was 7 years old. I could read music. I learned how to read Latin because I loved words, and I was an altar boy, so I not only would have, be a part of the Mass services, but I would want to know what these words mean, these Latin words. So I, found out through the Dominican library more about Latin, which helped me so much later in my career when I was working on operas that are in different languages. So it was there that I not only knew about or was introduced to the world of music and opera and Latin and words. And after a while, the nuns would smuggle me these books because I ran out of, in our own dorms and what they called cottages. I would read everything. And so I was smuggled one day a book by James Baldwin. And I can say this now, Sister Victoria smuggled me this book. And she says, I don't know what it's about. But she says, but, I know you've run out of books to read. And it was another country. And it was this graphic novel, and I'm reading this book. And it was extraordinary. So years later, when I'm working on Blue, I said, the thing that appealed to me about Baldwin, and then I was introduced to other writers, of course, was the role of women and how he was affected by women in his life. And I could certainly identify with that because I was brought up by nuns. The scene that came to me the easiest was the scene with the mother-to-be and the girlfriends. And it was because I would hear the chatter from the nuns, the different nuns, they wouldn't say, hello, Sister Victoria. They would say, good morning, Bartholomew, good morning, Victoria, good morning, Marianne, good morning, Tunisius, good morning, Dalmatia. I love the names of nuns. Yeah. And good morning, Terry, meaning Teresa, and of course, we could never say that. But that familiarity, which you'll see in the opera. And then, of course, in Harlem, I live on 113th Street, and on 112th around the corner is a grade school, and then 2 blocks on the other side is a high school. So I would see the mothers dropping off their kids, and the way they would, and the gossip that the women would have with each other. And there's a beauty parlor, which has unfortunately closed because they lost their business during the pandemic. But I got to know some of the women there, and I interviewed them. And they said, don't use my name in the opera. That's what they told. And then others said, use my name in the opera. So I was filled with what I heard as a child between the nuns and the camaraderie and the way the friendship and the dedication they had for each other. And they introduced me to the world of music, and they introduced me to the church and to discovering outside of myself that there's a world that would need me and that would need any of us in the school. So you'll see that in the opera. So those scenes with the women were very easy to write. The most difficult scene was the scene with the father and the son. I couldn't crack that for draft after draft after draft. I just couldn't write it. And I couldn't write it because I really didn't know my father, and I didn't have the relationship that is in the opera. I was not the boy or the son that's in this opera, but I think I would have been, so I could pull that side of me. I have a fear of police officers, and so originally the father was going to be a jazz saxophone player, and that's what my father was, a struggling jazz saxophone player who was never around, and when he was around, there was chaos. And I wrote that initially, and I wrote that in another draft. Finally, Janine Tesori said, "Don't you think we've seen a struggling black jazz musician enough on stage and in screen and television?" She was right. So I said, "Oh, yes, you're right." And then she said, "Make him a police officer." And I literally, for the rest of the meeting, I blacked out. I said no, but then I couldn't concentrate on anything else. And 20 minutes later or more, I finally said, yes, he should be a police officer, because I thought of how the conflicts that could arise, that the father of this boy, a police officer, would discover that his son was also killed by a fellow police officer. So once that happened, the scene didn't write itself, of course, but it was so much easier. But I couldn't write that scene before that. And in the first two drafts, there was not a son in the opera.
Oh,
there was
wow.
no son. And it was the father who collapses. He goes to the door at the end of Act One. There's a knock on the door, and the father goes to the door, and we don't know what is told to him, but he comes back into the room, and he collapses. And the mother realizes something happened to our son. Talk to me, and he can't. And that's how the first couple of drafts were. Now it's very different now. And then it was Janine Tesori and Francesco Zambello said, "I think you need to bring the son on stage."
So
that's how that happened.
So she was pregnant in the beginning, but then the son, you never would see the son.
Never.
Ah, so then you brought him in. Okay, so this is what you'll see. So the opera, I'm not going to tell you too much, but the first sort of there's a prologue that's staged, and then the first scene with busyness and there's just so much energy is of the mother and her girlfriends. And that scene, I just have to let you know, and I think I've mentioned it to you before, it was the first time, as you know, I've been going to the opera pretty regularly since the 80s, that I felt like I could climb up on stage and join them. I felt like I was there. So it's really interesting for me to hear that it's based on all the nuns, but then also the women dropping off their kids in your neighborhood. Yes. It feels so contemporary. The types of things they say to the mom, or who's just one of their girlfriends. I think one of the things this opera is really about is this element of transformation, and how in that opening scene with the mother, she's pregnant, but this is her first child, and she's much more of a girlfriend, and we find out how she fell in love and became a wife. And then it's later, shortly later, that we see her as the mother, and she's really born in that role. But that sort of chatter with the girlfriends, it feels so like, oh yeah, I mean, right. I just love the getting into that.
Also, the mother is based on, well, part of it is based on, there's a wonderful restaurant in Harlem, if you go to Harlem, called Melba's. And it's run by Melba, and it's soul food. And it's so wonderful that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, when they came to New York City,
oh my goodness,
they went to Melba's.
Wow.
And the mother in the opera has a restaurant that's called the Super Soul Bowl.
I know. It works.
And it's based on, so there's all these little, pieces of the nuns and of the women in Harlem and Melba, because she
love
has an
that.
establishment. She has her own restaurant.
I also want to say that even though the son was sort of an abstraction at first, I kind of see the son as having so much of you in him. He's an artist, and he has this incredible moral compass that from my getting to know you, it's just, there's a sense of what you do. And when life is giving us so many complicated things with all this police brutality, with COVID and how it's happening, the pandemic, so many things, like the many conversations we've had, there's always a sense of what you know. And
That's right.
there's something almost uncanny about this young boy who's 16, who stands up to his father, and the father is like, "Hey, you're my son, so know your place." But then in the very next scene, we see how the son has influenced the father, because then all of a sudden the father is saying a lot of the same things. I don't think I gave too much away, but you are very there.
You're right, and Janine has said that to me many times, and she's right. And I would say, no, this is not me. But it is me. My apartment, my small matchbox book of apartment in Harlem that I love is filled with artwork everywhere, masks and paintings, and I just surround myself with it. It's a creature comfort that is important to me, and I have walls and walls of books. And a sister, a nun who is no longer alive, Sister Janicia, who was, and Janicia is based on the Saint Genesius, who is the patron saint of actors. She was an activist in a time where a nun being an activist was unheard of. She eventually left the order, and that was a shock that just rocked the entire St. Dominic's convent. But she would stand up in church every now and then. She says, "How dare you say that and preach that, Father Farrell?" And we were just, because he would, there'd be things going on in the world, and she would say, "And why aren't women serving Mass?" And then she'd run out of church, and that would be, and the nuns would try to go around and cover all the kids' ears.
Okay,
But
so
it
no
was
wonder
a shock.
you're standing up for
Yes,
yourself.
and it was so shocking.
Wow.
And then I remember the Archbishop of Liverpool came to, and it was a big, we all had to sing something, we all had to recite something, and in comes Sister Genesius. And she not only stood up in the middle of this ceremony, she stood up on one of the pews, and she said, "I protest. This is what's going on in the world, and why are you talking about the loaves and the fishes?" She says, "You were talking about children who can't eat, and the starvation that's in the planet," and she just went on and on and on. And she was right, but it was a shock that a woman in a veil, in a habit, would be, and she was unbelievable. And then she would disappear for several days, and we found out that she was locked in her cell. They called it a cell.
Oh, wow.
And then she'd appear again, and and I was an altar boy, and I would see her, and my hand would tremble as I gave her, as the host was given to her. And then one time she grabbed my hand and she went like this while she had the host in her mouth. She went like
Oh, she sounds amazing.
So, so there's remnants of her in that, but you're right. A lot of me is in this opera, and it's that old adage is of, write what you know.
Yeah.
And because that's the only way that you can really express. And I've received very gratefully the compliment that the libretto is poetic, and it's and that it's beautiful, and I love
Yes.
that compliment, and I accept it. But it's based on my love of language, my love of words that started at a very early age, and it was nurtured by the nuns, so that when I went out into the world and I went to, higher education, I surrounded myself with books. And, during the pandemic, I read and read, and I binge watched on British procedurals. I ate, I cooked, I gained pandemic weight, and
hello.
I slept a lot. But I returned to my first friends, the books.
Yeah, I feel a camaraderie with you there. As an only child who grew up before the internet, we had a black and white TV without cable, and so the books were my friends.
Yep.
And I really can understand that. Now, the way you've connected with language and Latin is just, it makes sense how there's such a lyricism, which is hard for libretto because you can't have as many words as you do in a play because it takes longer to sing them. So all of this makes wonderful sense.
And I found out about that process through Janine Tesori.
How so?
Well, rewriting a libretto of The Second Hurricane is one thing because it's not mine really.
Sure.
But and I would take some words out and I would change it, but I didn't add anything. But with Janine, and when I write a play, I will have an idea and they will go on for pages and pages and pages. And I write with a yellow pad still, and pencil or pen, and then eventually I'll put something, in the computer, which scares me because it feels, like it's
More formal.
That's
yeah.
right. So I remember when I first showed the scene to Janine of the girlfriends, it went on and on and on and on. And she said, where do I get the music in this?
Oh, no.
When can the music enter? And I says, what do you mean? She says, well, they're not. She says, if they sang all of this, she said, that would be probably an hour's worth of music.
For the first scene.
Yeah, so she said, what is it you really want to say, and how can you abbreviate, reduce, keep that same feeling, but give me a line or two so that I can celebrate what you've written. She actually said, celebrate what you have written, and I can lift it, and I can nurture it, and I can what you feel is missing, I can supply through music. It was a wonderful lesson. And so as I started to work on different drafts, again, she had to remind me because I would just write and write and write and write. And she would say, okay, what am I going to say? And so it was broken down that way. And it was a very long process. It took us several years, or it took me several years, before she took over with music. And so that was a wonderful learning curve for me in writing a libretto, is that, writing a play is different. Also, I'm alone in my apartment writing a play. And then I may have a friend say, can you come over and I want to hear the play? Or I will walk around reading it myself out loud and taping my voice, reading it, and I'd say, oh, I can change that. But I had a partner writing an opera. And the most important partner, even more than the libretto, is the music, the composer.
Well, I love this idea of the music celebrates the text, because that's exactly what it is. When you have the text and then it sort of sparkles and things come out. But I like to hear this, how it was so thick and then you broke it down. But the wonderful thing about this, and I'll sort of mention something which I've been fortunate to see the workshop of this opera at Glimmerglass in 2018. And then I've seen the Michigan performances. There were two. And now I've seen it once last night for the dress rehearsal. And it's just amazing all the things that are still coming out with me, coming out that I hear in it. And one thing, and so I'm going to mention one thing because it was just so clever, and I think I had heard it, but it didn't really signal out. But a great example of your being so effective in how you cut down the three girlfriends is, I think it's girlfriend number 3, but one of them is really into the UPS men. She loves the uniform. She loves and it's just so funny. But I get a sense of her. You know, she's a little different. So notice when she'll mention UPS, the uniform, and the UPS men a few times.
Well, in Harlem, and it's, of course, during the summertime, Chandra, who has a small business, she runs out into the street when the UPS guy comes in because he's wearing shorts in the summertime, and she finally got a selfie with him, the poor guy. And so,
Oh, I love this. It's real.
so it's real. It's real. She says, it's not only the uniform, but it's the guy who's in that uniform.
Oh, I love this. So we are at a point now where we have plenty of time, and we will continue to talk. But I want to invite both the visible audience, who I can see barely with the lights in my eyes, if you've got a question. Also, I want to invite the people who are watching virtually to put in questions. I am sorry, I don't think I mentioned that up front. But please, if there are any questions yet, are there any questions yet? Oh, okay. Oh, and here, are there any virtual questions yet? No, I don't think so. But this is great. We've got a question here. Now, one thing I need to know, is there a microphone near you? Or how are we doing? Okay, and I'll repeat the question. I'm going to just jump in quickly to repeat the question. So the question is, and thank you, that helps, that a gentleman has said, here in Seattle, the Repertory Theater has done so much with August Wilson. And is there a connection between Tazewell's experience, both, I'm thinking, with his own family as well as a director with August Wilson? Does that represent the question? The families. So is there an interconnection between August Wilson's families that he writes about in Pittsburgh and your own family, as you've sort of the families we've constructed, the families you have?
Well, I've also directed a couple of August Wilson plays. I directed Fences and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom at Arena Stage. And while I was in rehearsals for Blue at Washington National Opera at the Kennedy Center, I was also in rehearsal for Seven Guitars at Arena Stage. So I don't know how this happened, but it happened. The opera was scheduled, and I had already said yes to Seven Guitars. And so I split up my time, and I had literally 12 to 14-hour days of rehearsals, and not a day off, because the operas, they always have set Sundays off, and the theater always has Monday off. And I'm not complaining, God. Believe me, I'm not. Consider the alternatives. I was very busy. And then at the final orchestra dress, over the loudspeaker came the notice, attention everyone, you must leave the building in no less than an hour. We are closing down because there is a pandemic. I don't think the word pandemic was used, but there's COVID. And
this is in March of 2020.
That's right. And so I said, so then I guess I'll be at Arena Stage then, full time. 2 days later, we were canceled. I love the works of August Wilson. There's no connection for me at all in his plays with my family, because I did not have the kind of families that are portrayed in August Wilson. I understand the culture, and I love and appreciate his language and his characters. He's an extraordinary writer that died much, much too soon. But he finished a 10-play cycle that is, it's every play is in a specific decade. or a specific year, and he rejoices and celebrates what happens during those years that are portrayed in the plays. My favorite play of his is, I have two, and I've not directed them yet, The Piano Lesson and Joe Turner's Come and Gone. Those are the two plays I really love. But I love all his works, and it's always a privilege to work with him. I can identify, and I certainly know how to direct them because I know this culture, and I love his language. And he writes in a very bluesy, jazzy sort of way. And there's a lilt, and there's a code is not the right word, but there's a way that he has captured the behavior and the attitude of African Americans. And it's not just specific to Pittsburgh, because anyone who sees his plays, black or white, they will get into the story and the characters, and they'll be transformed by the language. So I love his work, and I hear that Seattle Rep has been doing a lot of his plays. So congratulations once again, Seattle.
Yeah, absolutely. Looks like we have a question down here and then another one. Wait, was there in the second row?
I was just doing a fist bump.
Oh, okay, great. We have a question here.
So, I was wondering, you talked about your history quite a bit, and this opera has cops in it, but you're not a cop.
No,
And
no, 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 no.
even allude to your fear of them. So how do you channel or familiarize yourself with being an officer of the law?
I'm going to just repeat that for the people listening virtually. There's a question about Tazewell talking that he's not an officer of the law. In fact, there was even a little fear sometimes that you mentioned of an officer of the law. So how do you write about a character, or how do you make that a central focus of the story, even though that's not at all connected to your experience? Did I get that? Or yes, okay.
Yes, I have a real fear of police officers.
Even still.
Even still, and it's based on my experiences with police officers. I have dozens of stories that I can tell you. I'll just tell you very few quickly. One is I was in San Francisco working at the San Francisco Opera, and it was the opening night of the opera that I had just directed, and I was waiting for the car that was going to take me to the Opera House. I came down the elevator, I was in a tuxedo. And I never wear tuxedos, but you know, the Opera House said, we would like you to wear a tuxedo. They rented one for me. So I'm in a tuxedo, I'm coming down the elevator, and there are 6 young kids, Caucasian, they're wearing cutoffs, some are barefoot, and they're drinking. We all get out of the elevator, and we're walking this enormous lobby. A police officer comes over to me and says, what are you doing here? Do you have a room here? And I said, yes. Prove it. I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story, but that's one incident. Another was I was just coming out of a concert at Lincoln Center, a jazz concert, and Columbus Circle, I went into the subway. Columbus Circle is like 42nd Street subway. There's lots of lines that you can connect to, so it's always very busy. So I'm coming out of the concert, and it was especially crowded because there were other members coming from the concert, and there was another theater nearby. And so everything was letting out. 3 police officers came over to me and said, come with us. And what are you going to do? I'm not going to say, no, I'm not going to come with you.
Were you alone?
I was alone at the concert,
Yeah.
yes.
Wow.
And so they put me up against the wall, and then other police officers showed up and said, show us some identification. So I was carrying a messenger bag with me, and I had programs in it, and I said, I'm reaching into my bag, because I know this. I'm reaching into my bag to get my ID. I pull out my passport. And there's something in the opera that you'll see about carrying ID and so I said, I showed it to one of these brainless police officers. I said, what is this? I said, it's my passport. You don't have a driver's license? And I said, no, I don't drive. Well, this is no good.
What?
Seriously, and what am I going to say? You idiot, there's a passport, my picture's in it, my date of birth. This is no good. Flings it back at me. Meantime, a crowd, of course, was gathering. Other police officers were gathering. One police officer had his hand on his holster, and he approached me and he said, I'm sorry, you have to show us more ID than what you have. So 2 police officers then joined the crowd, and I'm terrified.
Of course.
And people have out their cell phones, and they're starting to record this. And these 2 other police officers, what's going on? He says, look at him. This could be our guy. And one of the police says, he looks nothing like him. What's the matter with you guys? He says, well, yeah, but he didn't even have proper identification on him. He said, well, what did you have? So I said, I had a passport. You numbskulls, a passport. So he said, all right, so rather than saying this police officer, who I thought had a brain and a heart, he said, all right, you can go. And as I started to leave, he said, and stay out of trouble.
Oh, gosh.
My next story about police officers is very short, is I live on 113th Street. On 112th Street, during the Giuliani administration, when he was mayor, I was stopped by 2 police officers. There was the whole stop and frisk that Giuliani had started, and said, where are you going? And I said, home. Where's home? And I said, right there. All right, we'll walk, we'll follow you. So I took out my key, I opened the door, they followed me into the lobby, and then there was another, into the mailbox area, there was another key. And I thought they would leave, and they said, so you really live here, huh? And I said, yes. 2 residences of the apartment building were coming down the stairs, Caucasian. Hi, Taz, how is it? What's going on? Oh, I guess you do live here. So that's how that ended. So writing about a police officer, when Janine said, make him a police officer, you can understand that I blacked out. And I said, no way am I going to write about a police officer. However, once that became a reality, and a very good conflicting one, I interviewed a police officer that I knew in the neighborhood, an African-American man, and he had 2 teenage kids, a young teenager, she was 13, and a 16-year-old. And he said every time when he comes home from work, from being a police officer, his little girl, he calls his little girl, runs and jumps into his arms. Daddy, Daddy, I'm so happy that you're home. His son, wherever he is in the apartment, goes into his room, closes the door, doesn't even greet his father. Can't stand the idea that his father is wearing a police uniform. So I interviewed him, and we talked about what it's like to be a black police officer in blue. And then there was another police officer when I was at Arena Stage directing a play. He was a member of the cast of, I was directing A Raisin in the Sun, and he was one of the moving men. And I said to him, I said, I don't know anything about, usually we go around the room and say, who you are and what. And he says, well, I never like to say what, what I was. And I says, well, you can tell me. He says, well, I was a police officer. And he says, I retired. I've been doing it for many years, and I stayed with the police department because of their insurance and their dental coverage. And he said, did you know that you receive dental for life? Not only myself, but my family, dental for life covered. And he says, and I have insurance. That's also in the opera. And he said, you know, I've been struggling now to do what I really want to do, which is be an actor. And so I noticed that he would always have these little flourishes. When he would just be moving a chair, he would move the chair and he would do something a little, and I said, what are you doing? You're just a moving pick up and go. And then, so he couldn't get rid of that, so he would come back into the apartment again, and because there was Benitha and Mama Younger in there, he would pick up something, drop it, and then he'd tip his hat, and he'd bow. And I said, no, just pick up.
Oh, he was
priceless. But then I was able to get him work at the Opera House as, you know, a supernumerary coming on and, just being in the opera. So he's a wonderful guy, but he also told me some wonderful things about being a police officer wearing blue. So that connection, I had to get over that obstacle, that challenge of my feelings about police officers. But it was also useful to have it in the opera.
Oh, absolutely, because you're saying that you were even a little afraid, and even today, of police officers.
Terrified.
The father comes off so incredibly loving. So there's this beautiful moment where he sings a lullaby to the baby, and I'm like looking at you thinking, oh gosh, I hope I'm not giving too much. But he's the father you want. He's the policeman you want.
Yes.
He is amazing. So you sort of crawled inside and captured something pretty amazing.
What's also interesting, what I learned about from these two police officers, is that they are conservative, not in a political sense, but they are conservative and by the law and by the letter. In terms, they have made a pledge as a police officer, and even how they dress and what they look like and how they, walk through a neighborhood and how they speak to each other on the street. It's ingrained in them, and I never knew that. And how they will defend each other, even when they should not be defending each other, when it comes to crimes that they've committed or witnessed a killing and they've done nothing, or the corruption. It's a very tight, thin blue line. The other thing that I found out is the white police officers and the black police officers, they are miles apart from each other.
So the code
They
of
never
blue
attend
doesn't.
ball games together. They don't go to, there's a big bowling community in Washington of black police officers, and they're separate.
Oh, wow.
Now, they'll come together when something happens to a police officer.
Okay.
As just before I arrived in Seattle, there were 2 police officers killed in New York City, if you remember that.
Yes.
And police officers from all over the country showed up. There's a big funeral in St. Patrick's Cathedral. There they are, side by side.
Okay.
But when it's over, there's a separation.
Wow. And that's an interesting point as I'm thinking about the boy as he grows up with his father and the problems he has with and it's just kind of implied, the white police officers, that obviously the white police officers would know that this is a boy, is a police, in the family.
The son of a police officer, yes.
However, in my mind, I was thinking, well, maybe they would. Maybe they'd be at the park together playing, at family picnics with other, but the fact that those don't happen.
That doesn't happen. I mean, I'm
Interesting.
sure it might somewhere.
Right, but that's not sort of the norm.
No.
Oh, gosh, we've got wonderful questions. So, I'm going to ask, is there a question from the virtual online people? Ah, good question. So I think everybody can hear. Rebecca from online was wondering, are there any new operas in your future? What are you working on now?
I have 2 commissions, and it's exciting, thrilling, scary, because it's writing a libretto, which is very different form, but I love it.
Wow.
One is based on a monument that I have noticed whenever I work in D.C. I remember passing this monument that's outside of St. Matthew's Church, which is a church that is famous because it was where the funeral for John F. Kennedy was held. Right outside of the church is a monument called Nuns of the Battlefield. So nuns, of course, I wanted to, and I visited it a couple of times, and I'm looking at this monument, and it's 12 nuns who were nurses during the Civil War, who also were nuns, not just nurses, and they're all in different habits because they're all different
Different orders.
There's a Dominican nun and Holy's Name and Charity, all of them. And they're all Caucasians. And I said, oh, that's curious. And because I read, I remember coming across a book about a black nun that I had not read, but I have the book. And she served during the Civil War, and she was a nun, a black nun. And she kept a diary, a journal, and there's a book. And so when I was asked by the Chicago Opera Theater to write a libretto and to come to me rather than a composer first was wonderful. And I said, yes, I would like to write about this black nun who's still in a habit from the Civil War, who's been searching for this monument that she heard about. And she comes to the monument, and then all the nuns step out of the monument. And this is the first draft so far. It could be radically changed by the time. But I'm really intrigued by it, and it's certainly a connection that I have. And she wants to know, why am I not up there? And so, of course, there's the different types of nuns that I experienced. There's one very dominating nun who refuses to have her part of the monument because it's all done. And then there are other nuns who feel compassionate. And then there's a very activist nun who, and they all are aware of what has gone on while they've been inside this monument, how the world has changed, and they discuss it and they sing about it. And then I have another wonderful, wonderful commission, which I'm not allowed to talk about. I was told I cannot mention it until the end of March when it will be announced. It's a big, big commission of a very famous thing that's happening in New York City. And I was approached to not only write something, but to direct this whole evening. It's going to involve two other black composers. One is Hal Stark, and the other is, oh God, how am I going to forget this? Help me, you must know, because you know everything about opera.
Oh, wow, thank you. So Adolphus Hale Stork and Anthony Davis.
Nope.
Damien Sneed.
Nope.
Nkiru Koya, a woman. No, a man.
No, it's a man, but it's...
Let's see. Oh, there are a bunch.
He's no longer alive. That helps.
Okay, that helps. William Grant
Yes.
Still. Okay.
Bingo. I told you.
I was thinking of the living ones. Oh, wow, that's exciting.
And then I'm going to be one of the three who's writing something that opens up the whole evening, and I can't say any more than that.
Okay, we are going to keep our eyes open. Adolphus Hale Stork, William Grant Still, and Tazewell Thompson. At the end of March, we will be able to know.
Read it, yes.
Excellent. Other questions? Let me take one from our literal, I'm so bad at this, our in-person audience, and then we'll go back to the virtual audience. There's Michelle right here.
I have another non-question. Trying to envision whether you were in a community of white nuns or if there were mixed or black, like I don't know if they were segregated or what. And having her give you a James Baldwin novel, that coming from a black nun feels different from coming from a white nun. So I'm just trying to envision the story in my brain.
So this is a question about the nuns that Tazewell grew up with. What was their sort of racial ethnic background? Were they all white? Was there Latino or other types? Were there black nuns there?
Well, this is why the Nuns of the Battlefield appealed to me, because there wasn't a black nun that was depicted. And until I left St. Dominic's, I didn't know there were black nuns. All the nuns were white. And because it was a Catholic convent, I was one of very few black kids, orphans. They referred to us as orphans, and I wasn't an orphan, but our sister Manita kept saying, "No, you were an orphan, Mr. Thompson." I said, "No, I'm not. I have a mother and father." Oh, wow. But you know, so all of that different types of temperament is very useful to me because, you know, when I depict all of these 12 nuns, and I never knew there was any black nuns at all until I came out of the convent. And there's a wonderful convent in New Orleans, and it's practically all black nuns. So that's why I think I have a lot I can bring to this particular project, this commission. Now, Sister Victoria, she didn't know what another country was about. She just said, here's a book. She gave me another book called Straight as the Gate by André Gide. And I'm 9 years old and I'm reading Straight as the Gate by André Gide. And it took me forever because A, I didn't know what was going on. It was a brilliant book. Many years later, I realized when I had a wonderful high school teacher who was also a poet. I was so fortunate, Daisy Alden. And it took me, usually I just can go through a book and go, but I took forever because each page was so surreal and so wonderful and so dreamlike. So I would smuggle several books, and Sister Victoria didn't know. Here's a book, here's another book, oh, here's another book. And one of them was Another Country by James Baldwin. I think if she knew, she never would have given me that book because it was quite graphic, as I remember. And of course, I love James Baldwin. Read everything about it, all his books and his essays especially. And there's a line in the opera at the end of a scene where I remember reading The Fire Next Time, and I have the father say something, uses that title in a certain way.
The Fire this time, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have another question from our virtual audience?
We do, yeah. We have one last question from Cheryl. She wants to know, once you finalized the libretto and Janine started writing the music, did the text continue to evolve? Did she ever ask you to change words occasionally and make the sentence fit with the music?
So that question is, how much, once the libretto was finished and you were working with Janine Tesori, did she ask for some alterations? Did she ask for, or did new things kind of evolve once she was working on it?
Yes, we had a wonderful process, and I missed the process. And I can, of course, impose it on the composer I'm working with now with the Nuns of the Battlefield, but she had a great, great process. Whenever she felt she had to compose a scene or or an aria, she always called me to her studio, and she had me read the scene, read a couple of pages of the libretto, and then read it again. And then she'd go back and say, oh no, read this section. Because she wanted to hear my voice in what I was reading. And then she would say, do you mind, I'm going to repeat this. And she says, but maybe you might want to change these two lines here, and maybe, do you think it might want to come earlier? And so I always, certainly listen to her because she's done everything. She's done operas, she's done Broadway shows. She had a show that just closed on Broadway, Caroline or Change. She has another one that's opening on Broadway in October, and she's written for film. So, she was my master class teacher and my partner in this. And so, yes, the libretto did change. I would rewrite, or I would shorten something, or I would expand. Whenever she asked me to expand, of course, yes, I want to expand. So that was helpful. There's something that happens in the final draft that came as a revelation. There's a final scene in the opera that's called the epilogue. That was not there when you saw it in the workshop.
No, there were
was-
words,
The
but
words
the
were
music
there,
hadn't
but there
been
was
there.
no music, and we didn't know whether we wanted to, but we both felt that we needed to include it. One of my favorite plays is Our Town by Thornton Wilder. And at the end of Our Town, Emily, who has died, goes back and she's told that she can choose one day in her life. And they said, just pick an ordinary day. Don't pick a special day. But she chooses a day and it's too much for her. And she begs to go back to the dead because she doesn't realize how valuable and how wonderful life was. She sees her mother and she sees, her brother, and everything is happening around her, and she's trying to tell them, stop, stay still. But of course, they go on with their life, and they're saying, get ready for school, Emily. What's the matter with you, Emily? What's going on? And it's too painful for her. And so I said, we need something like that at the end of the opera. So that was new, and I wrote that in time for the final workshop, but there was no music. The other big thing that happened was there's something in the Black community and Black families that's called the talk. And when I interviewed parents that I got to know in my community of Harlem, Black and white, the white parents never have this talk with their kids.
They don't need to.
But Black parents do, and they tell their kids, don't do this, wear this when you're going this way, have ID, have an extra ID, don't reach into your pockets if you're stopped by someone, don't have anything shiny. So I had that earlier in the bar scene. But because the bar scene was so celebratory, it felt odd to keep that there. And it was something that I just instinctually knew, but I was certainly proud of it when I wrote it in that moment, that we would have this celebration and it would turn. But then I said, no, this has to be this one really boisterous, noisy celebration about the father having a son. So I moved it in a scene which you'll see the talk comes up in a scene that I never thought I would put it in, but it's in that scene, and when you see the opera, you'll see where the talk shows up in a scene that I never expected myself I would put in there. And when I showed it to Janine, she said, yes, this is where it belongs.
I love what you do in the bar scene because it does take sort of a different turn, but it's very fun. When it's welcome to baby jail.
Right.
And the fathers are sort of talking about and that wonderful line about murdering sleep,
Right.
that little Macbeth
From
connection.
Shakespeare.
Yes.
This is what pays off all my reading that Sister Victoria would hand me.
It's great. But it just works. It's sort of serious enough, but there's a certain jocularity there. So you get sort of a contrast, but the mood fits. There's a question there. I was going to say the person in the black mask, but yes, you.
Yeah, I'm not sure just exactly what to say here. The issue is deeper and more complicated than just blacks and the police. Gone with this one.
So we have a comment which I feel free to respond to, where a gentleman has said that the police, their tactics of intimidation and the increased militarization of the police have made this a difficult situation for everyone, for the black community, but as well as for everybody is feeling intimidated in how they sort of are interacting with the police. So we're in a tough situation right now. So it's something that feels like it's maybe been ratcheted up more recently or over the past few decades. And there's some wonderful literature about this. Michelle Alexander is the one that comes to mind with the new Jim Crow and how what was happening in the 1980s with the war on drugs, there was sort of a concurrent moment where sort of the response of law and order was making things tough. I don't know if you want to respond to that or.
I do, yes. I think everyone who has a job has challenges and obstacles, and they have things that they have to confront just walking out into the street, walking, going to work, the responsibilities they have at home. I think that doctors, imagine the weight of the world that's on their shoulders always, but especially during the pandemic, and nurses. And, my heart bleeds and goes out to them that they have gone through what they've gone through and continue to go through what they go through. Doctors, nurses, yes, lawyers. Teachers are next to God for me, but imagine the responsibilities that they have. Walking into a classroom, their first few days, weeks of school, getting to know each of those individual students and the lives that those students, these kids, or high school kids bring with them into the classroom, and how they have to bring them around to a place where they can open up their minds and their hearts to learning something. And they're trained. I hear you when it comes to police officers, I do. But I also have to say that when something happens to a man or a woman, but in this case I would say a man because that's what I see mostly, when they put on a uniform and they have a gun and they have a baton, a nightstick, and they have a badge, there's something changes in that person. When you look at documentary films and you see police officers, they have no right to use water cannons to wash away young kids who are demonstrating for civil rights. They don't have that right. They don't have the right to practically beat to death citizens who are walking across the Pettus Bridge, who are peaceful demonstrations. They don't have the right to charge up to peaceful protesters, these men who are on horseback, and start beating away Mexicans who might be trying to get into our country. They just don't have that right. I hear you, and yes, it is a difficult job, and not all police officers are like that. But what I remember when I was a child, and I would see these horror of dogs being leashed and unleashed onto protesters, or police officers would come in and drag people off out of sitting at a soda fountain because they wanted service in a Woolworth. Those images are deeply embedded in my, and it's awful. So then you have January 6th, and the majority of those men and women who stormed the Capitol, who broke windows, who defecated, who urinated, who beat up police officers. Imagine, just imagine, if that group of thousands, of hundreds, at least thousands, who stormed the Capitol, if they were black. Imagine what the death toll would be and on what side it would be, and who would have shown up to protect the Capitol. So I hear you, but I'm sorry, yes, they have a difficult job. But, the most difficult jobs are the jobs of doctors and nurses and teachers and other professions that I can't at this point think of. And they're trained, and they have to understand human nature, and they also have to be introduced to our shared humanity. I don't know what the training is of police officers. I haven't delved deeply into that, but I do know that something does happen when a man or a woman is given a uniform, a badge, and a gun, and a baton, a nightstick. And what is it there for? What is it there for? And are they trained when to use and not to use? And does, when someone is stopped because something is hanging in the back of their car window, do they have to approach the car with their guns already drawn. I was minutes away. In that story I told you when I left the jazz concert, one of the police officers started to unbuckle his holster and had his hand on his gun. What had I done? Nothing. I looked like, according to one of those police officers, someone that they were searching for. And it was a completely different complexion, very light-skinned complexion. When they found the man, he had a white parent and a black parent, so he was very, very light-skinned. And I'm hardly anything like that. I was a black man.
Yeah.
That's all it was. And George Zimmerman, 10 years ago tomorrow, killed a teenage boy because he said in court he was a black kid in our neighborhood, and his father lived a couple of blocks away, and he looked suspicious. So I shot him.
The amazing thing about Blue is that it shifts our vantage point to a vantage point we don't get, and that is of the black family with a police officer, and what that must be like for the father, for the mother, and she drops little hints there about sort of, and the girlfriends talk about, you know, him coming home, is he gonna come home, and how, sort of what that's like, and it gives us a new vantage point on thinking of these incredibly difficult realities right now around policing.
And also, I love this black police officer in this.
And that comes through.
I love all four of these police officers.
We love them, and they become
they're
our
lovable,
yeah.
and
so there's the tensions of race,
and they love their
almost
families,
brought
and they love their
together.
communities,
Yeah.
and they're proud of who they are.
Yeah.
And the father, in his scene with his son, he says, this is what I do.
Right.
And I'm proud of it.
And he believes in it, yes.
And, it helps put food on the table and a roof over your head.
Right.
And so I identify with that.
You see,
I'm
I
still
think
in fear of police officers.
the
I just have to say
amazing
it.
thing, though, of what this opera is doing is it's allowing people who are black to get a sense of the police, sort of a different conversation about policing. It allows non-black people to see another view, a vantage point of what policing is, how it moves in so many different ways. I'm so sorry we've got to stop our conversation. I've been getting the note, and I appreciate all of you staying here and coming out for this. I just want to thank Seattle Opera. I want to thank the people who have been virtually watching and tuning in. Thank you so much for being here in this audience and asking questions and making this a real community. And very lastly, thank you, Tazewell. Thank you.